This is the first lecture for Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse for chapters 1 through 4. Now, if I asked you to do the hero's journey with Siddhartha, I'm going to ask you to read not just chapters 1 through 4, but chapters 1 through 5, because you're going to need that fifth chapter to finish the hero's journey. In addition, you have the Siddhartha's journey map that I want you to fill out as well. All the items in the legend need to be filled out in the on that map, as well as other notes, other things that you're seeing, connections that you're making. That map is going to be your tool for remembering this book. First off, in the structure of the novel, we have a three-part structure. Now, the novel itself is divided into two parts by the author. Part 1 is chapters 1 through 4, and Part 2 is chapters 2 through 12. At least that's the way Hermann Hesse has it set up in the book. But most people who read it don't believe that that's the case. It should be three sections. All right, the first section, this section right here, is going to be spirit. This section over here is going to be flesh. And then the river, the blue mark, is going to be unity or balance. It's however you want to think of it. I'm going to be thinking of it in terms of unity mostly. So we have that three-part structure. So be watching through that. You can see that it's pretty evenly divided. We have 4 chapters in the spirit section. The next 4 chapters are in the flesh section, and the last 4 chapters, are in the unity section. And we're going to call each group of 4 chapters a triad. Now, the purpose of the chapters is to present an argument or to present a transformation, a reflection, a transition. So, for instance, chapters 1, 2, and 3 are going to present the argument from the spirit side. Chapters 5, 6, 7 are going to present an argument from the flesh side. And then chapters 9, 10, and 11 are going to present an argument from the unity side. And then chapters 4, 8, and 12 are going to be our reflection, transition, and transformation chapters. Okay. Each of the chapters in the triad could be retitled. So, and what I mean by retitled is they serve a purpose, and if we were to label what that purpose is, chapter 1, chapter 5, and chapter 9 could be retitled Rituals of. So rituals of spirit, rituals of flesh, rituals of unity. Chapters 2, 6, and 10 could be relabeled Extremes of Spirit, Extremes of Flesh, Extremes of Unity. You see how this works. Chapter 3 is a little bit different, though. The third chapters are a little bit different. Chapter 3, Chapter 7, and Chapter 11 are going to be labeled on the Spirit side Apex of Spirit. Apex means the highest point. On the flesh side, it's going to be Nadir of Flesh. Nadir is going to be the lowest point. And then we'll have fulcrum for chapter 11, the fulcrum of unity, or the fulcrum of balance, however you want to think about it. And then each of the fourth chapters, 4, 8, and 12, we can label realization of spirit, realization of flesh, realization of unity. And realization can mean several things. Realization can mean an idea that comes to you, kind of like an epiphany. Or a realization is to make something real or actual. And both meanings are intended when I say realization of. Start off with Govinda, because the book does. And as we're thinking about this three-part structure, Govinda is the next major character after Siddhartha. Govinda symbolically represents the spirit of Siddhartha. So I'm not to say that these aren't real people. Siddhartha and Govinda, each 2 separate people. However, Govinda is representing Siddhartha's inner self. And we see that in the first sentence. We have in the shade of the tree, in the sunlight on the riverbank near the boats, in the shade of the sal tree forest, in the shade of the banyan fig, Siddhartha grew up the handsome son of the Brahmin, the young falcon, together with Govinda his friend, the son of a Brahmin. Now, there will be something else I want you to see in this sentence later on. However, notice that Govinda is of the same quality, the same type as Siddhartha. And I also want you to notice how many times trees come up here. They come up 2 times, sal tree and banyan tree. In both cases, this is in the shade. Shade might be something spiritual, like a ghost could be a shade. Shade could be something dark, and in terms of the yin-yang, which we're using as kind of our map, the dark side should be the soul side, believe it or not. Okay, and we also have this connection with the real Buddha, who, by the way, his name was Siddhartha. Siddhartha Gautama is the Buddha's real name. And Buddha found enlightenment underneath a fig tree. And so here we have right off the bat a connection between our Siddhartha in the book and the Buddha, but also a connection in spirit with Govinda and Siddhartha. Now, it's maybe not the greatest connection, but it's still a connection. We'll do this, we'll see this a little bit later on. All right. In the first paragraph, still trying to connect Govinda to the soul, Siddhartha had already been participating for quite some time in the discussions of the sages. With Govinda, he practiced debating. With Govinda, he practiced the art of concentration in the service of meditative absorption. Okay, so once again, we see Siddhartha and Govinda together, and they are a team, both moving forward into the spirit world, both learning these spirit skills. In the first chapter, and if ever Siddhartha were to become a god, if he were to arrive among the radiant, then Govinda wanted to follow him as his friend, his companion, as his servant, his spearman, as, and here's the most important word, his shadow. So once again, shadow being something related to shade, related to spirit, we're kind of connecting the idea that Govinda is Siddhartha's shadow. Now, when we think in terms of the real thing and the shadow, what's the most important? Well, that would be the real thing. So Siddhartha is more important than Govinda. And so shadow, they're the same thing, but we want to focus on Siddhartha as being the important thing, Govinda being a part of Siddhartha, in this case the spirit part. When in the first light of day, stiff-legged, Siddhartha slowly left the still silent city near the last hut, a cowering shadow rose up and attached itself to the pilgrim, and that would be Govinda. Okay, so once again, twice in that chapter, we have the idea of Govinda being a shadow, the spirit side of Siddhartha, which is appropriate that Govinda goes with because this is definitely moving into extremes of spirit. We're going to want our spirit with us. All right, once again, in the shade of the banyan tree reminds us of the Buddha, connecting shade with spirituality. Govinda stays with the Buddha. We've already read that, hopefully. Govinda stays with the Buddha. That is the apex of spirit. The highest point you can get spiritually in terms of this book is the Buddha. He's the enlightened one. Enlightened one means perfect one. And Govinda does not go with Siddhartha into the flesh world. That is, he doesn't cross the river with Siddhartha at all. He just stays with the Buddha with the highest point. Govinda will see Siddhartha 2 more times in the book, and both times I want you to watch his reaction to Siddhartha. Okay, Govinda is a very important character, even if he's not showing up. Now, I want you to notice something. A couple slides back, we talked about how Govinda wanted to be with Siddhartha when Siddhartha found perfection. And I want you to notice that that's from Govinda's perspective. The whole book is going to be from Siddhartha's perspective, except for this little part here in chapter 1. And then there's going to be an entire chapter later on in Govinda's perspective. And I want you to be thinking about that. Why? Why don't we just keep everything from Siddhartha's perspective? Why is it important that Govinda has some words here? So we'll come back to that in our third session. All right, one thing I want you to notice about style of the author is the number 3. We've got a 3-part structure. Spirit, flesh, unity. We've got 3 chapters that go along with our argument. We have 3 women in the book. You haven't seen, well, if you've read a little bit into chapter 5, then you've already read about 2 of the women, believe it or not. But if you haven't read any part of chapter 5, you've only read about 1 woman so far. And you may be wondering, who's this woman I'm talking about? Reread. There's a woman in there that they have a conversation with. Okay, Siddhartha has 3 spiritual mentors. We don't know any of them really quite yet. Well, I shouldn't say that. We know the Buddha, right? We know the Buddha, and we know Govinda too. So we know 2 of the 3, don't we? And there's one more spiritual mentor. Govinda will see Siddhartha 3 times. And then we have the Samanas in chapter 1, and they're labeled as 3 scrawny men. But if we look even closer in the text, we're going to notice that not every phrase, not every clause, not every sentence, but many of the phrases and many of the clauses and many of the individual words in Siddhartha are combined in 3s. And whenever I see one that pops up in an example, I'll try to show that to you. So the number 3 is very important. Well, why? Because 3 is an archetypal number referring to completeness. Okay, now we're talking about an archetypal structure, the hero's journey, which means it's a structure from a long time ago that many stories seem to follow. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that when we meet together as a class in the fall. We'll talk a little bit about Little Red Riding Hood and some of the archetypical things, like, for instance, black almost always means mystery. White almost always means purity. Red can mean love, sex, violence. Then numbers have certain meanings. So in this case, the number 3 from a long time ago refers to completeness. We think about 3 legs on a stool, for instance. You can't sit on a chair or a stool unless it has at least 3 legs. But there are some other examples of 3s in life. We have Freud. Freud has the conception of the ego, the superego, and the id. We have Christianity's Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We have in Greek mythology the idea that fate is divided up into 3 old ladies, and exactly the same 3 old lady types are found in Norse mythology as the norms. In Hinduism, which is the religion we're really talking about here, we have 3 main gods. Now, Hinduism has 33 million gods. 33 million. Wow. But there are 3 main ones. That is 3 gods that almost everybody worships. And that's Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. And these are the 3 most important gods. The one I want you to remember, the example of 3 that I want you to remember, though, is mind, body, and spirit. And I want you to think about, if we were going to take those 3 things, who would be the characters who would best represent those 3 things? Who would be the mind, who would be the body, and who would be the spirit? All right, there's also something else I want you to be looking for here, and this is in the legend that I have on that map. And this is for the bird motif. In the Samanas, in the chapter called With the Samanas, we see that a heron flew over the bamboo forest, and Siddhartha took the heron into his soul, flew over the forest and the mountains, was the heron, gobbled fish, hungered as a heron hungers, spoke heron croak, died the death of a heron. Important? Not on its own, probably. A little weird, but on its own it's probably not important, except in light of the entire book. You don't have the advantage of having read the entire book yet, but birds are going to be slightly important in the book. Now, a motif is not quite like a symbol. A motif is an idea, a pattern. Actually, pattern is probably a good way of thinking about it. So there's a bird pattern throughout. In this case, it's just a reference to a heron. It's not symbolic. In other cases in the book, the bird will be symbolic. And the meaning of bird will actually gain some meaning over the course of the book. So this is why I want you to focus on this. So on your map for the Siddhartha's journey map, I want you to mark, at least for chapter 2, there's a bird, a reference to a bird that's pretty important here. Okay, now birds aren't the only thing I want you to focus on. I also want you to focus on snakes. In the chapter 4 called Awakening, we have Siddhartha. He was aware that he had been deserted, as the snake is deserted by its shed skin. He was deserted? I thought he left on its own. Who deserted him? And the answer is his spirit, Govinda. He's going to move, Siddhartha is going to move into the flesh side, and the spirit refuses to go with him into the flesh. So the way Siddhartha sees it is that the spirit has deserted him because Siddhartha's got to go on his journey. The spirit is staying behind. So he's been deserted by his shed skin, that something was no longer available to him, something that had been with him and belonged to him all through his youth. Notice Govinda belonged to him. And we also have this idea that it was also the wish to have a teacher and to be taught. Now remember that Govinda and him were practicing debating, practicing contemplation. Govinda was one of his teachers. Even though it wasn't a teacher, he was a peer, he was still helping Siddhartha learn these skills. Okay, so now we're getting rid of all these spiritual teachers. While Siddhartha was thinking these thoughts, again he suddenly halted, stopped still, as if a snake lay on the path ahead of him. Okay, so now we have the idea of a snake again. In this case, it's as if something is going to kill you. And in a way he's putting to death his spirit side. So I want you to watch snakes. Snakes are a very interesting creature. At the very beginning of its tail, you have this small little opening, kind of like a beginning. And if you follow the snake from tail to head, you get to the head, and that's where the fangs are and the poison is, and where you'll find death among certain types of snakes. So snakes kind of represent both life and death, and oftentimes you'll see a drawing of a snake biting its tail, and that will represent the entirety of life, birth and death, and maybe even reincarnation, because out of the mouth of death comes life again, if you want to think of it that way. Alright, another motif I want you to focus on is the lip motif. By lip, though, I want you to expand that to being smiles, being countenances, faces. I want you to focus on the expression, but we're going to simplify it right now, just call it a lip. First lips that we find is the Buddha. The Buddha went on his way unassuming and sunk into contemplation. His still countenance was neither happy nor sad. It seemed gently to smile inwardly with a hidden smile, calm, peaceful, not unlike a healthy child. Notice the smile is hidden, and it's not really a happy or sad smile. You can tell he's smiling, but it's almost undefinable. And that's because we don't understand enlightenment from our perspective. We don't understand what it is to be perfected. We're going to find out a little bit later in the book what it might mean, and it's going to make a little bit more sense that the smile was happy or sad, or neither happy nor sad in this case, which is to say happy or sad. Anyway, we also have today we shall hearken to the teachings from his own lips. One of the reasons why lips and smiles are important is from lips we get knowledge. That's how people talk. Or do they? Later on in the book, once again, we're going to see that the lips stop communicating with words, although they're still going to be communicating. And that's the important thing. We're going to have to figure out how to get enlightened. So we're going to want to focus on people's lips. And finally, away walked the Buddha, and his gaze and his half smile were forever engraved on Siddhartha's memory. Siddhartha is going to go into the flesh world, and he's going to remember the smile of the Buddha. He's going to remember what enlightenment looks like, peace looks like. All right, finally, this is just some information that I find interesting. We're not going to do too much with this, but the name Siddhartha is also the name of the Buddha. We mentioned that earlier. Siddhartha is Siddhartha Gautama. Now, we have two different Siddharthas here. We have Siddhartha, our character, and Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha. Notice we connected them at the beginning with trees. That's where the Buddha found enlightenment. We have Siddhartha being underneath a tree as well. We're going to split them up as we do in chapter 3, make sure they're two separate things, and then we're going to bring them back at the end. And I want you to watch the motifs that come together there when we bring them back. All right, then we have Govinda. And Govinda is interesting because it's the name of the 8th incarnation of Vishnu. Remember, Vishnu is one of the 3 main gods. Vishnu is the life preserver in Hinduism. And he has this incarnation that is, think of it like in the same way that Jesus is the incarnation of God the Father, that is God made physical. So is Govinda. Govinda is the 8th, what they call Krishna, the 8th incarnation of the god Vishnu. So Vishnu is always incarnating himself one after the other. So we have Govinda. Then we have Kamala. We're going to see her in chapter 5. Kamala is a name that's reminiscent of the god of love, Kama. But the word Kama itself means desire or distraction. And I think we'll see that Kamala is quite desirous and also quite a distraction to Siddhartha. And she's also going to be like the god of love to him. So that's a very apt name. We're also going to come across a character called Kamaswami. Once again, Kama means desire or distraction. Swami means master or owner. So Kamaswami is going to be the owner of desire or the owner of distraction, the master of these things. And finally, we come to a very, very important name. And we're not going to see this name for a while. It's going to be chapter 9 before we actually figure out who Vasudeva is. But Vasudeva is one of the forms of Vishnu, like Govinda. And in the Vasudeva form, Vishnu exists within the souls of all living beings and in every substance. So everything has the god Vishnu in them through Vasudeva. Okay, that's complicated, and I think it will be made more real once we get to chapter 9 and we begin to realize who Vasudeva is.